The moment humanity unleashed everything did not begin with alarms or speeches, but with a vote taken in silence beneath the Atlantic Ridge, where the Earth Defense Assembly gathered far from public record, and Admiral Lena Ortiz watched the final authorization appear on the table. Knowing it marked the end of a century of restraint, the quiet removal of limits humanity had accepted to reassure a fearful galaxy, and when she confirmed the order, her voice was steady because the scenario had been planned for longer than most civilizations had known humans existed, and across human space systems that had waited patiently for decades shifted state, reserved to active, observer to participant, not erupting into chaos but moving with practiced precision. While far beyond the Sol perimeter, the Car Dominion fleet advanced in tight formation, convinced it was about to deliver the final lesson to a species it viewed as diplomatically clever but strategically timid, a species that protested in councils, appealed to law, and accepted losses rather than escalate, and Supreme Commander Frexel observed the advance with confidence reinforced by every prior encounter where humans had chosen negotiation over force, interpreting that choice as an inability to do otherwise. And so when reports came in that human border stations were vanishing from sensors, Frexel dismissed them as evacuations until an aide noted that no debris fields existed, no power spikes, only absence and irritation. Replaced certainty as Frexel ordered the fleet onward, unaware that the disappearance was not retreat but preparation, the clearing of space for something far larger. And on Earth, Ambassador Rahul Deshmukh stood alone in the empty Galactic Council chamber, recording a final statement for the archive, calmly stating that humanity had exhausted peaceful options and would now act to secure its survival and that of its people, a message he delayed sending because timing mattered now more than words. And beyond Dominion space, the first human transit corridor opened, not ripping reality apart, but folding it with mathematical elegance. And through it emerged not a warship, but a massive logistics platform that immediately began anchoring structures to local gravity wells, manufacturing corridors with industrial efficiency, confusing Dominion scouts whose sensors filled with cascading noise not from jamming, but from too many variables introduced at once. And as reports flooded in Dominion, Command struggled to classify what it was seeing because the humans were not attacking, they were building. And when the first Dominion fleet group vanished entirely, enclosed within a containment pocket that isolated ships and crews without harm, panic spread through command channels because this was not annihilation but removal. And on Earth, Admiral Ortiz authorized the next phase as autonomous fleets long hidden in plain sight unfolded from civilian infrastructure across dozens of systems, revealing that humanity had never truly been confined to its borders, only quiet, embedding itself everywhere it was allowed while obeying every rule. And now the battle space belonged to humans not because of firepower alone, but because they dictated the environment itself, closing and opening corridors, isolating fleets, shielding worlds, denying opportunity rather than seeking destruction. And when Dominion weapons finally fired, they struck emptiness as targets vanished milliseconds ahead of impact, guided by predictive systems trained on decades of Dominion doctrine. And on human colonies once under threat, civilians watched the sky fill with stabilizing constructs instead of explosions as humanity demonstrated that unleashing everything did not mean abandoning control. And as days passed and resistance collapsed into isolated pockets, the Galactic Council reconvened in shock, while Deshmukh transmitted his message alongside live feeds showing fleets contained, world secured, civilians unharmed, stating plainly that humanity was not conquering but correcting an imbalance the galaxy had refused to address. And within the Dominion Senate, chaos erupted as leaders realized their fleet were intact but unreachable, their command frozen by human systems that redirected resources away from war without destruction. And when Frexel was finally restrained, it was by gravity lock that held him without pain as a human envoy informed him hostilities were over and negotiations would begin. And in that moment he understood the error shared by many before him, that restraint was not weakness but choice, and that humanity had only unleashed everything to ensure it would never again be forced to. In the aftermath of the first containment events, the galaxy struggled to understand what had happened because there were no wreckage fields to analyze and no casualty reports to quantify, only silence where Dominion task groups had once transmitted confidently, and this absence unsettled military planners far more than destruction would have, because annihilation fit established models while removal did not, and within the Dominion command structure, confusion deepened as analysts attempted to reconstruct events using fragmented sensor data that refused to align, discovering that the human deployments followed no linear advance pattern but instead form a layered lattice of influence that reshaped the battle space itself, and Supreme Commander Threxel convened his senior staff demanding explanations only to receive projections that shifted with every update, showing human logistics nodes multiplying. Transit corridors opening and closing with deliberate timing, and entire regions of space becoming inaccessible not through blockade but through geometric denial, a concept Dominion doctrine had never considered viable because it required patience, foresight, and an acceptance that control mattered more than spectacle, and as frustration mounted, Threxel authorized reconnaissance and force actions meant to provoke a response that could be measured, ordering several fast strike wings to push toward human nodes and force an engagement, yet those wings encountered environments that behaved unpredictably, inertial frames subtly altered, sensor horizon compressed, propulsion efficiencies fluctuating just enough to disrupt formations without causing damage, and crews reported the disturbing sensation that space itself was resisting them, not violently but firmly, guiding them away from objectives like a river redirecting debris. And back on Earth, Admiral Ortiz monitored these developments with a quiet intensity, conferring with analysts who confirmed that the Dominion was reacting exactly as predicted, escalating in search of clarity while humanity denied it, and she authorized continued restraint on direct weapons use, insisting that the galaxy must see not just human capability but human intent, because the objective was not submission through fear but stability through undeniable competence. And on the diplomatic front, Ambassador Dishmook was no less busy as emergency communications flooded in from neutral and allied species demanding explanations, assurances, and clarification of human goals, and he responded with transparency that startled many, providing data access to containment protocols, humanitarian safeguards, and withdrawal conditions, explaining that humanity's actions were reversible by design, that every corridor could be closed, every node dismantled, every containment released once binding guarantees were in place. And this openness contrasted sharply with the Dominion secrecy, shifting opinion quietly but decisively, and within Dominion space civilian populations began to feel the effect of the human economic algorithms not as deprivation but as subtle redirection, military manufacturing slowing as resources flowed toward infrastructure repair and food distribution, preventing unrest even as senators argued, because the algorithms were not punitive but corrective, optimize or remove the Dominion's capacity for sustained aggression while preserving internal stability, a nuance lost on hardliners but noticed by planetary governors who realized their worlds were safer with humans managing the flow than their own war-focused central command, and this internal divergence weakened the Dominion further as loyalty fractured not through rebellion but through pragmatic acceptance, and in the midst of this unraveling, Threxel received a request for dialogue transmitted on a secure channel that bypassed Dominion encryption entirely. Not hacked but politely integrated, offering a meeting between equals under conditions of mutual safety. And though his advisors warned of traps, Threxel agreed because options were evaporating, and the meeting took place within a neutral gravity pocket where physical presence was replaced by high-fidelity projections, and the human representative spoke without triumph, outlining the sequence of events that had led here, the ignored warnings, the tolerated losses, the decision to act, emphasizing that humanity did not seek the Dominion's destruction but its compliance with a system that protected all participants, and Threxel countered with accusations of manipulation and covert expansion only for the human to calmly provide records showing every deployment was within previously agreed civilian frameworks, reproposed only after legal withdrawal from restrictive clauses triggered by Dominion aggression. And this revelation struck hard because it meant humanity had followed the rules so thoroughly that even now its action could not be cleanly condemned. And, as the meeting concluded without agreement but with understanding, Threxel returned to a command that no longer felt absolute, aware that the Dominion was losing not because it had been overpowered in battle, but because it had been outmaneuvered across time, space, and perception. And as weeks passed, the galaxy adjusted to a new operational reality where human presence was constant but non-intrusive, decisive yet measured, and military academies quietly began revising curricula while councils debated new treaties framed not around limiting human power but aligning with it. And humanity continued to hold a position not advancing further, not withdrawing, simply maintaining a state that forced everyone to confront a fundamental truth that power used sparingly could be far more transformative than power unleashed recklessly, and that realization marked the true turning point of the conflict. Because from that moment onward the question was no longer whether humanity would win, but what kind of order would follow once the galaxy accepted that it already had. As the standoff solidified into an uneasy calm, the Dominion's remaining active fleets found themselves operating in a galaxy that no longer behaved according to familiar rules, because every attempt to maneuver, resupply, or reposition required human tolerance rather than permission, and that distinction eroded the psychological foundation of Dominion command authority, since officers were forced to request corridor stability windows from systems they did not control and to accept routing. Suggestions that optimized safety rather than tactical advantage, and while no formal surrender had been issued, the reality of dependence spread quickly through the ranks, leading some captains to stand down voluntarily rather than risk incidents that could further justify human oversight. And within the Dominion Senate, the political consequences intensified as factions formed around competing interpretations of survival, with hardliners demanding resistance at any cost and pragmatists arguing that continued defiance would only prolong humiliation and endanger civilian worlds now demonstrably vulnerable to environmental manipulation rather than bombardment, and these debates were no longer theoretical because planetary governors reported that human stabilization constructs had prevented orbital decay events, solar flare damage, and supply chain collapses caused by the Dominion's own wartime strain, creating a quiet but undeniable contrast between the central government's promises and the tangible results of human intervention, and this contrast began reshaping public sentiment across Dominion space in ways no propaganda could counter because the evidence was lived experience, and on Earth Admiral Ortiz faced her own pressures as domestic leaders questioned the sustainability of maintaining such a vast operational lattice. Yet the data showed that once established, the system required surprisingly little active input because it had been designed for long-term equilibrium, rather than constant force projection, allowing human crews to rotate normally, civilians to continue their lives, and economies to function with minimal disruption, reinforcing Ortiz's long-held belief that the true strength of the plan lay not in its scale but in its efficiency. And as weeks turned into months, humanity's restraint became more unsettling to observers than any show of aggression would have been, because it denied opponents the narrative of righteous resistance and left only the uncomfortable choice between cooperation and isolation, and it was in this context that a coalition of mid-tier species petitioned the Galactic Council to formally recognize humanity as a guarantor power, a role previously rejected out of fear that concentrating such influence would destabilize the balance. And when the Council convened to debate the proposal, the chamber was filled with representatives who had once dismissed human warnings as exaggeration, now speaking cautiously, aware that their words were being measured against a backdrop of undeniable results, and Ambassador Deschmok addressed them without leverage or threat, simply presenting projections showing conflict reduction across affected regions, trade normalization, and civilian safety metrics improving steadily under the current arrangement. And he concluded by stating that humanity did not require formal authority to continue acting responsibly, but that legitimacy would allow coordination rather than improvisation, framing the decision as a choice of the Council rather than an ultimatum. And this approach further undermined opposition because it preserved agency even as it constrained options. And within the Dominion Supreme Commander Threxel watched these developments with a growing sense of inevitability as his own influence waned, because every external validation of human leadership weakened his argument that resistance would restore Dominion prestige. And when a senior admiral resigned publicly, citing the impossibility of meaningful command under current conditions, a symbolic blow rippled through military culture, signaling that the old order was already dissolving, and Threxel requested another meeting with the human envoy, this time not to contest facts but to negotiate terms that would allow the Dominion to retain internal sovereignty while accepting external constraints. And the meeting proceeded with careful formality as both sides outlined non-negotiables, with humanity insisting on enforceable protections for civilian worlds and transparent military limitations while allowing cultural and political autonomy. And as the discussions progressed, it became clear that the Dominion's survival as a coherent entity now depended on accepting a role it had once scorned, not as a dominant power but as a participant in a system where dominance was no longer the organizing principle. And this realization marked a profound shift for Threxel personally because it forced him to confront the legacy he would leave, whether as a leader who drove his civilization into ruin through pride or the one who preserved it through adaptation. And as negotiations continued behind closed channels, the galaxy watched closely, understanding that the outcome would set a precedent for how power was exercised moving forward. And in countless academies and councils, analysts dissected every human decision not to replicate it but to understand it, gradually recognizing that the true Lesson was not technological superiority but strategic patience, the willingness to absorb losses, gather data, and wait until action could be decisive and final. And as this understanding spread, the fear that had once driven anti-human sentiment began to transform into cautious respect, because it became clear that humanity's greatest advantage was not what it could do when provoked, but what it chose not to do. And that realization reshaped galactic politics more profoundly than any battle ever could. The formal negotiations that followed unfolded with a gravity rarely seen in galactic history, because for the first time a major power was bargaining from a position of preserved strength rather than defeat, and that paradox unsettled many observers who struggled to reconcile the absence of visible devastation with the scale of concession now being discussed. And within the neutral frameworks established by human containment architecture, delegations convened under conditions of perfect informational symmetry, where no party could obscure troop movements, economic flows, or environmental impacts, ensuring that every claim was immediately verifiable. And this transparency altered the tone of diplomacy itself, stripping away performative posturing and forcing representatives to argue from reality rather than rhetoric. And the Dominion delegation arrived constrained but intact, its members keenly aware that their fleets remained suspended in stable isolation, crews safe but unreachable, a constant reminder that failure to reach agreement would simply prolong a stasis that benefited no one. And Supreme Commander Threxel participated directly, his authority diminished yet his responsibility undiminished, as he sought terms that would allow the Dominion to re-enter galactic society without permanent subjugation. And the human delegation led by Dishmuk and supported by technical advisors approached the talks not as victors dictating surrender, but as engineers refining a system, focusing on mechanisms, thresholds, and fail-safes rather than punishment. And they proposed a layered security framework where human oversight would scale dynamically with verified compliance, gradually receding as trust metrics improved, a concept alien to Dominion thinking which had always equated security with constant projection of force. And resistance emerged primarily from factions who feared that such metrics could be manipulated, only to be countered by the humans. Willingness to subject their own systems to identical scrutiny, establishing mutual accountability as the foundation of the agreement. And this reciprocity resonated beyond the negotiation chamber as other species observed that humanity was binding itself to the same constraints it demanded, reinforcing perception that its intervention was principled rather than opportunistic. And as sessions progressed, technical discussions replaced ideological ones, with engineers debating corridor, governance, economists modeling resource redistribution, and legal scholars codifying intervention triggers, transforming what could have been a ceasefire into a comprehensive restructuring of interstellar security. And throughout this process, Threxel's internal struggle deepened as he recognized that the very qualities that had once fueled Dominion expansion, centralized control, rigid hierarchy, and aggressive doctrine, now impeded his ability to adapt, and he found himself conceding points. Not out of weakness, but because the data left no room for alternative conclusions. And outside the negotiations, Dominion citizens followed development through controlled but increasingly candid channels, learning that their fleets were unharmed, that food shortages were easing, that planetary infrastructure was stabilizing, and this information eroded support for continued defiance, shifting the political center toward acceptance. And when protests erupted, they targeted not humans but Dominion. Hardliners who were perceived as clinging to pride at the expense of security, and this internal pressure further constrained Threxel's options, making compromise not just strategically sound but politically necessary. And on Earth reactions were mixed as well, with some fearing that humanity was assuming a burden that would entangle it indefinitely. Yet the data-driven approach reassured many that the system was designed for eventual disengagement rather than perpetual dominance. And Admiral Ortiz addressed these concerns by emphasizing that the architecture was modular, capable of scaling down without collapse, because it was never meant to rule the galaxy, only to prevent it from tearing itself apart. And as the final terms took shape, the Galactic Council convened to ratify the framework, an act that symbolized a shift from reactive governance to proactive stability. And when the vote passed, it did so with an unprecedented majority, reflecting not enthusiasm but recognition that the alternative had already been rendered obsolete. And as signatures were affixed in containment field prepared for phase release, the galaxy collectively exhaled, aware that a precedent had been set not by conquest but by controlled intervention. And Threxel, standing at the center of this transformation, felt the weight of history settle as he understood that the Dominion would endure change but intact, because humanity had chosen a path that allowed enemies to become participants, And that choice, more than any weapon or fleet, defined the true scope of what had been unleashed. The implementation phase began quietly, almost anticlimactically, because the machinery of stability does not announce itself with spectacle, and as containment fields were selectively relaxed, Dominion fleets re-emerged into a battle space that no longer invited battle, guided instead into monitored corridors that prioritized safe return over tactical positioning. And crews who had expected interrogation or retribution were met with procedural debriefs focused on system integrity and crew welfare. A treatment that unsettled many veterans more deeply than punishment would have, because it challenged the narrative that humans were enemies to be feared rather than administrators of an unwelcome but effective order, and across Dominion space the redirection of resources became visible in everyday life as shipyard converted to civilian production, transport networks normalized, and planetary defense budgets shrank in favor of infrastructure investment, changes that would have sparked unrest under normal circumstances, but now unfolded with surprising calm because the benefits were immediate and measurable, and this calm spread to neighboring regions where other powers observed that compliance with the new framework did not erode sovereignty but insulated it from escalation, leading several minor conflicts to de-escalate preemptively rather than risk triggering intervention. And within the Galactic Council, this behavioral shift prompted a re-evaluation of long-standing assumptions about deterrence, as analysts noted that fear-based models were being supplanted by expectation-based ones, where actors adjusted behavior not to avoid punishment but to align with a stable equilibrium that rewarded predictability, and humanity's role in this transition remained deliberately understated. With Deshmukh declining ceremonial recognition and Ortiz refusing proposals to formalize a permanent command, reinforcing the message that human leadership was situational rather than absolute. And this restraint frustrated some allies who desired clearer hierarchies but reassured many who feared dependency, and within the Dominion political landscape the consequences were profound as Supreme Commander Threxel announced his resignation, framing it not as capitulation but as a completion of his duty to ensure survival, and his departure diffused lingering resistance by removing a symbol of confrontation, allowing reformist factions to consolidate authority and pursue integration with fewer internal obstacles. And as new leadership took shape, it embraced transparency measures once considered unacceptable, opening military data to external audit and participating in joint security exercises designed to test rather than provoke, and these exercises revealed another uncomfortable truth, that Dominion forces performed better under the new constraints than they had under old doctrines, because clarity replaced bravado and objectives were no longer distorted by the need to project dominance. And on Earth, public attention gradually shifted away from the crisis as daily life resumed its familiar rhythms, yet the systems humanity had activated remained in place, quietly adjusting, learning, and refining parameters, and this persistence raised philosophical questions among human scholars about responsibility and power, debates that acknowledged the risk of overreach while recognizing the cost of inaction. And as years passed, the initial shock of humanity's intervention faded into institutional memory, replaced by a cautious normalization where the presence of human frameworks was accepted as part of the galactic background, much as gravity or radiation had been omnipresent but rarely considered until absent. And it was during this period of normalization that the true impact of the moment humanity unleashed everything became apparent, because it had not frozen the galaxy in fear but unlocked pathways of cooperation that had previously seemed impossible, and younger generations across multiple species grew up in an environment where large-scale war was a historical concept rather than an expectation, studying past conflict with curiosity rather than trauma. And while tensions and disputes persisted, they were contained within mechanisms that prevented cascade, validating the core premise of the human approach. And for those who remember the days before, the contrast was stark, a reminder that power exercised with intent and restraint could reshape not just borders but behavior itself. And in this quiet success humanity found neither triumph nor regret, only the sober understanding that unleashing everything had never been about dominance, but about assuming responsibility that no one else had been willing or able to carry. With stability largely restored, the galaxy entered a phase of reflection that proved as challenging as a crisis itself, because peace enforced by systems rather than shared belief required constant cultural adjustment, and across worlds philosophers, strategists, and historians debated whether humanity's intervention marked the end of traditional power politics or merely a pause enforced by superior capability. And these debates mattered because they shaped how future generations would interpret the balance between autonomy and security, and humanity did not shy away from participating in these discussions, opening its archives, publishing decision models, and allowing external scholars to examine the reasoning that had led to the activation of the lattice, an openness that contrasted sharply with the secrecy that had defined most galactic powers and further demystified human actions, reducing fear through understanding. And yet this transparency also revealed uncomfortable truths, including projections that showed how close the galaxy had come to cascading collapse had the Dominion conflict continued unchecked, data that forced many leaders to confront the inadequacy of previous governance structures. And within the reformed Dominion, these revelations accelerated cultural change as military academies rewrote curricula to emphasize systems thinking over conquest and political institutions decentralized authority to prevent single points of failure, reforms driven not by external mandate but by internal recognition that survival now depended on adaptability rather than dominance. And Supreme Commander Threxel, now a private citizen, watched these changes from a distance, occasionally consulted as a historical witness rather than a leader, grappling with the knowledge that his greatest contribution to his people had been stepping aside at the right moment. And on Earth, Admiral Ortiz also stepped back from active command once the lattice reached a steady state, transferring oversight to a civilian military council designed to prevent concentration of authority, a decision that surprised those who assumed she would consolidate power but aligned with her belief that no individual should be indispensable to a system meant to outlast crises. And Ambassador Deschmo continued his work in quieter ways, mediating disputes that now rarely escalated beyond economic or legal friction, often invoking the memory of the Dominion conflict not as a threat but as a case study in consequences. And as time passed, the phrase "a moment humanity unleashed everything" took on a different meaning in galactic discourse, less a reference to military activation than to a philosophical turning point when a species chose responsibility over retreat. And this reinterpretation mattered because it reframed human power as a stabilizing constant rather than a looming danger. And younger civilizations entering interstellar society were taught early not that humans were invincible warriors, but that they were relentless problem solvers who would intervene as systemic risk crossed certain thresholds, a lesson that encouraged compliance through predictability rather than fear. And inevitably there were challenges as rogue actors tested boundaries, launching localized conflicts or attempting to exploit perceived gaps, yet each incident was resolved with minimal disruption as the lattice adapted, applying pressure precisely where needed and withdrawing once conditions normalized, reinforcing confidence in the system's fairness. And critics remained, warning that reliance on human frameworks risked stagnation or complacency, concerns humanity acknowledged by actively encouraging regional solutions and gradually transferring components of the lattice to multilateral control, ensuring redundancy and shared ownership. And this gradual diffusion of responsibility marked another quiet but profound shift as the galaxy learned not just to accept human leadership but to internalize its principles. And in this maturation process the memory of open war receded further, replaced by a collective understanding that some threshold once crossed could never be ignored again. And when historians marked the anniversary of the Dominion crisis, they noted not the fleets contained or the corridors open but the absence of subsequent galactic wars of similar scale, an absence that spoke louder than any monument. And for humanity the legacy was complex, carrying pride tempered by vigilance, knowing that the decision to unleash everything could not be undone and that its consequences would echo long after the architects were gone, yet accepting that burden because the alternative had been unthinkable. And as the galaxy continued forward under a quieter sky, the truth settled into common wisdom that humanity had not changed the universe by force alone, but by demonstrating that overwhelming capability paired with restraint could redefine what power meant, setting a standard that others would be measured against for generations to come. In the decades that followed the crisis, the galaxy slowly reached a point where the systems humanity had activated faded from conscious awareness, not because they were gone but because they had become reliable, a background constant woven so thoroughly into interstellar life that only specialists still tracked their adjustments. And this normalization marked the final phase of the transformation, because true stability is measured not by vigilance but by trust, and that trust had been owned through consistency rather than force. And historians later noted that no formal declaration ever marked the end of the Dominion conflict, no surrender document or victory celebration, only a gradual shift where the question of whether war would resume simply stopped being asked. And within the former Dominion, the changes solidified into a new identity as world once unified by conquest learned to cooperate through shared infrastructure and mutual accountability, discovering that influence could be maintained through reliability rather than fear. and former adversaries integrated into broader trade and research networks, contributing innovations that flourished precisely because the pressure to weaponize every advance had been removed, and Supreme Commander Threx will pass into history not as a villain or a hero, but as a cautionary figure whose final decision preserved his people at the cost of an era, a trade later generations judged necessary, and on Earth the events were taught, with similar restraint, framed not as a triumph of human superiority but as a lesson in escalation management, emphasizing the years of preparation, the warnings issued, and the deliberate choice to act only when inaction posed greater harm. And this framing mattered because it shaped how humanity saw itself, not as a ruler of the galaxy, but as a participant burdened with unusual capacity and therefore unusual responsibility, and as new species emerged into interstellar society they encountered. Humans not as conquerors, but as mentors and auditors, patient but unyielding when systemic risk appeared, a role that was sometimes resented but rarely challenged because the evidence of its necessity was embedded in shared history, and while conflicts never vanished entirely, they remained bounded, resolved through mechanisms that prioritize containment over dominance, reflecting the philosophy humanity had demonstrated when it unleashed everything without surrendering control, and in quiet. Moments veterans of that turning point recall the fear of those days, the uncertainty of activating systems no one else truly understood, and the relief when they realized the galaxy would not burn as a result, and that relief endured as a clearest proof that the decision had been justified. And when asked in later years whether humanity would do it again if faced with a similar threat, the answer was always measured, never enthusiastic. Because unleashing everything had never been an active pride but a necessity, a line crossed with full awareness of its consequences, and the galaxy, shaped by that choice, carried forward with a deeper understanding that strength did not lie in the ability to destroy but in the willingness to prepare, endure, and act decisively only when no other path remained. And so the story of that moment ended not with a final battle or a fallen enemy, but with a quieter victory, a universe that continued, imperfect but intact, under the shared understanding that some powers, once revealed, changed the rules forever, and that humanity, having revealed its own, chose to live with those rules rather than rule by them, ensuring that the moment it unleashed everything will be remembered not for what was broken, but for what was preserved.